George Santayana once said, if you're ignorant of history, it's going to repeat itself. And I felt like going into this important renegotiation of what has been a very successful and one of the few successful international water treaties in the world, that proceeding straight ahead in ignorance was a mistake. So we are going to begin with a presentation on the modern history of the Columbia Basin, which is intended to serve as a background. And we have a distinguished historian, Professor Paul Hirt, from the University of Arizona, who is an historian and is in the Department of History, but is also a scholar in, and here's somebody else that gave some money, Julie Ann Wigley, Global Institute of Sustainability. Paul specializes in the history of the American West, global environmental history, environmental policy, and sustainability studies. And his current research includes projects that are collaborative, interdisciplinary, and focus largely on environmental issues. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Hirt.
Thank you, Henry. Thanks for the invitation to this great conference. Thanks, everybody, for coming back after lunch. The dreaded post-lunch low blood sugar session. So hopefully I'll keep you awake. If not, I'll have everybody stand up and take a deep breath. Full disclosure, number one, I've been in Arizona for a long time, but I taught at Washington State University for 11 years, and that's when I began my Pacific Northwest research. And so I'm not a total foreigner to this region of North America. Another disclosure, I'm mostly an American historian, a classic parochial-focused guy who decided not to be that anymore. I dabble in Canadian history, but please don't ask me any really detailed questions about Canadian history or you'll embarrass me. I'll have to turn to one of my colleagues to answer it for you. And finally, full disclosure, my presentation is a little bit more and quite a bit less than what the title says. So hopefully this will work for you in the post-lunch moment. So long view, I just want, one of the things that historians contribute to these conversations is long-term perspective. It's so easy for us to get wrapped up in the moment, in our current time period, and to forget, number one, how much things change over time, how much our societies and our values and our economies have evolved, and it can actually give you a little bit of confidence and a little bit of optimism in the face of a lot of deep and seemingly intractable challenges if we realize how much we really have changed over time. So human uses of rivers in the Northwest and the Columbia Basin in particular have constantly evolved. And I'm just going to look at maybe 300 years here. During the Aboriginal period, the rivers were primarily used for food and transportation and regional trade. And they were very important in sustaining both the communities and fairly extensive trade. Like there are examples of people trading Minnesota pipestone in the lower Columbia Basin and the great big trade fairs around the large waterfalls like Celilo Falls, where there's a great big trade fair every single year. So transportation, food, and regional trade have always been an important component. Well, let's go back to colonial. Then there was sort of the contact of cultures, and in this colonial period, the rivers continue to serve those three main purposes, but the trade purpose became international and became commodity focused. In particular, there's a good 60 to 100 years in which the fur trade profoundly influenced the communities along rivers and changed the economy of the region and even began to change the rivers themselves. That was a period of empire, and we're still sort of in that, but maybe more a legacy of empire that faces us today. I'll talk a bit about legacies in just a moment. Then we get a period, I'm going to draw it from the 1860s to the 1960s, just a 100-year period. That's really not a lot of time in human history, but it seems like a lot of time if you're not paying attention to history that much. That 100-year period, we saw tremendous economic development and mass consumption here in, well, not here, over the mountains in British Columbia, a great deal of mining development that profoundly influenced rivers. Lots of petroleum mining over here, but I'm not sure it got started as early as the 1860s. I kind of doubt that. A lot of commercial fishing that altered both the rivers themselves, but what lived inside of those rivers. When we weren't doing subsistence fishing anymore, we developed new technologies, nets and boats that could be strung across the entire mouth of a river and capture everything that came in. We had a boom in the fish supply and then a crash afterwards from overexploitation. We started experiencing these tremendous booms and busts based on what we now call unsustainable resource economics. This is all part of this 100-year period. We didn't have much of that prior to this period. Then there's a period and you can do your own periodization. This is almost arbitrary. These made sense to me, particularly if we're looking at the Columbia River Basin, Northwest U.S. and British Columbia. From the 1960s to the present, a lot of changes have happened, a lot of shifts. First, we get serious, significant international cooperation. Before, we had things like the Boundary Waters Commission that tried to deal with conflict resolution in boundary waters, but we didn't have anything called joint development like we did in the Columbia River Treaty that you'll hear more about today. We get really extensive international cooperation following the 1960s. We get a really tremendously expensive and engineering-focused emphasis on flood control in the Columbia River Basin, building gigantic dams to store huge amounts of water, to try to hold it back during the spring and let more of it out during the summer. We talked about flood control for a long time before the 1960s, but we didn't really invest the money and the technology to really do good flood control until the 1960s, so that's sort of new. And maximizing efficiencies, this was a psychology adopted in the 20th century that really takes off in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that says, these resources we used to think were so abundant, we're now noticing scarcity, competition over what remains. We're starting to feel the pinch. Let's get the maximum amount out of these resources that we can. Let's be as efficient as possible and get as much productivity as possible wring out of nature every possible dollar and every possible job. There was a great statement by one of the British premiers in a publication back in, I think if I remember correctly, back in the 1950s. He said, "Let every drop of water do its duty." That was the title of one of my chapters in my book, The Wired Northwest. I thought it was such a good symbol of this age, this post-war age of maximum development and maximum efficiency. Let every drop of water do its duty. But there's also a bunch of really interesting, contrary, potentially conflicting things happening in the 1960s, more broadly in our society, affecting rivers. We start talking about mitigating externalities in the economists' phrasing. What that means is solving problems that we've created with our economic development, basically. There's a lot of economic development that has unintended or sometimes intended consequences that aren't sort of internalized into the market price of the things that we produce. The loss of salmon in the process of developing a super efficient hydropower system is an externality to the hydropower system. We knew that we were losing salmon throughout the 20th century, even going back into the late 19th century when we first started building large dams that blocked salmon runs. We knew that we were trading off salmon for hydropower. But for a long time, we seemed to have so much salmon and so little electricity that Americans and Canadians decided it was worth the trade-off. And as we had more and more and more electricity and less and less and less salmon, people became more uncomfortable continuing to make that trade-off. And by the 1960s, even earlier in British Columbia, by the 1920s, there's pretty significant counter-movement to begin to keep dams off of certain rivers that were still good salmon producers because they decided that there's no way that dams and salmon can really efficiently, effectively coexist. The Fraser River was saved from being dammed mostly because of both indigenous and commercial and sport fishing interests saying, we've seen where we tried to manage a river for both dams and salmon and it didn't work. And so we're going to keep dams off the main stem of the Fraser and preserve that sockeye salmon run. Folks in the United States never came to that realization, or those who did were always a minority. And for the rest of the 20th century, Americans continued to believe that they could have dams and salmon, and you know how well that worked out. So, mitigating externalities, restoring salmon, talking about indigenous rights and sovereignty, democratizing decision-making. This was an incredibly powerful sort of policy revolution in the 1960s and 1970s that said, you know what? Insulated government bureaucrats and corporations shouldn't be able to make decisions this important and this far-reaching and this permanent without some kind of participation from the public. We should be disclosing to the public what it is that we intend to do. We should be talking honestly about the trade-offs and environmental impacts and social impacts and economic implications. We should solicit comment from the public. We should give the public the right to access all the information we have about this decision that we want to make. And we're going to empower citizens to appeal our decisions and sue us in court if they don't like it, if they think we're violating the law. And once the decision is made, if we don't implement that decision in the way we promised, we're going to allow citizens to be watchdogs, to call us when we fail to implement these laws and policies that we came to agreement on democratically, and to sue us to make us do the things that we're supposed to do if we don't want to, if we bureaucrats are dragging our feet. You know, before the 1960s, citizens didn't have those tools. So be thankful that you live in a generation that created those tools, and I know there's a whole bunch of people in this room that have become adept at using those tools to effect significant change. That was a reform of the 60s and 70s that we should be proud of. So there's constant change in the water policy environment, but just to be honest, there's also a lot of momentum. There's a lot of inertia. There are sunk costs that we can't simply ignore. We can't turn on a dime. The ship of state is a big, like the Titanic, and it takes a long time to move it. And that's because of momentum and sunk costs. And those include past policies, past priorities, infrastructure that we've built. They all have these legacy effects. That's just a little list of, hey, there's Vancouver. We can't just decide not to have that anymore. We can't just decide not to have the location of our high voltage power lines. As we talk about trying to bring in more renewable sources of energy, one of the big debates down in the western United States and in the Southwest is we've got a ton of potential for wind energy in the Great Plains, in the windy prairies. But where's the market for that energy? Not in the windy prairies. There's not that many people living there. They got plenty of energy now. The market's in the big central cities far away from the windy plains. We don't have a high voltage transmission system designed to bring wind from Nebraska to California yet. So there's a lot of talk about building new infrastructure to make it possible to open up certain kinds of renewable energy. Well, infrastructure kind of determines what our options are. And if we want to do something different, we have to invest in new infrastructure, which costs money. And then the anti-tax people get in there and say, you can't raise my taxes. So change does happen, but inertia also happens. And that creates a kind of an evolutionary model similar to what the ecologists say biological evolution takes place in a kind of a punctuated equilibrium. Or for those of you who are river runners, a pool and drop scenario. So you go along nice and calm for a while, things seem stable and predictable, and then boom, something happens. And then you go along nice and calm for a while, and then boom, something else happens. That seems to be the nature of the evolution of large technological systems and policy regimes, et cetera. So we might ask here today how, when, and why are significant structural and institutional changes possible? Those forks in the road that we talked about in the morning session. We never really hit a brick wall. Sometimes we do, but sometimes the brick wall topples over. Usually we turn. Just before we hit the cliff or the brick wall, hanging on by our fingers sometimes. But I think the forks in the road is a good metaphor. And how and when do we get to these forks in the road? Well, there are certain triggers, and this is where my pessimism kicks in. You're going to find out I'm kind of an optimist. I used to be more of a pessimist. I sort of evolved myself. My pessimism comes in when I realize as a historian that most significant transitions to current systems that we've got in place happen because of crises. Floods. In fact, it was a flood that led to the first effort to get a Columbia River Treaty signed and agreed to by the United States and Canada. A massive flood in 1948. And the United States said, oh, we've got to do something to get some more flood control on this river. And they realized that they were going to have to get Canada to agree, because Canada had a lot of the big storage potential for those who saw the river basin as a place to store water for later use. So hydropower and flood control were the two things that went into the Columbia River Treaty. That was why we went after it, and that's what went into the creation of it, basically. Drought. We haven't had to talk very much about drought here in Western Canada and the Pacific Northwest, but now we hear about it all the time. Oregon has been dealing with drought in the Klamath region for 10, 15 years and causing all kinds of serious conflict between fishing interests, tribal interests, and agricultural interests. There's not enough water, even in Oregon, to meet the needs that we've allocated out. And I heard earlier today that there's even droughts in the western half of British Columbia, or at least people are talking about a shortage of water. We call that a drought in Arizona. Up here, I guess you just call it a temporary shortage until it rains. You know, in Arizona, we get 7 inches of rainfall a year in Phoenix, and we have 4.5 million people living in this desert metropolis with 7 inches of annual rainfall. So drought is pretty significant in the American Southwest and California, and it's getting worse. Climate change is reducing snowpack, and most of the river flow that we depend on is based on snowpack. About 80% of the Colorado River's flow comes from snowpack, not from rainfall. We have a couple of rainy seasons, winter and summer. Summer rainy season really doesn't contribute much to our water supply. So as the Rockies get less and less snowfall, those glaciers start melting and disappearing, our river has less water in it, significantly less. And Colorado River has 15 million acre feet legally allocated to the 7 basin states, and another million acre feet allocated to Mexico. And of course, when they did this in 1922, they allocated nothing to Native American tribes. And now the tribes are winning water rights back. And so out of this 15 million acre, 16 million acre feet of allocated water, the tribes are pulling theirs out. We actually have only about 13.5 million acre feet of water in the river. Because when they measured the river in 1922, it had been about a 15-year wet period, anomalous wet period, when they measured the river. And so they were wrong already. And the climatologists are saying we'll be lucky 10, 15, 20 years from now, we'll be lucky if there's 12 million acre feet of water in that river. And we got 16.5 million acre feet of confirmed rights to that water. There's all kinds of science fiction writers now writing stories about what the future is going to be like in Arizona, Nevada, and California. There's a new novel out by Paolo Bacigalupi, good Italian name there, don't you think? Called The Water Knife. Anybody got it or read it yet? Brand new. The Water Knife. It's about the future in Nevada and Arizona. Everything's fallen apart. Climate change has happened. There's no water anymore. There's mafias and wars between the states. So if you're a pessimist, go after this book. You're going to love it. If you're not, continue listening to my presentation. Other triggers for water policy transitions are often technological. New technological innovations, new opportunities offer us, like right now, we're in the midst of an energy transition. I'm sure any of you who are over 30 years old can remember just 10 or 15 years ago saying, how are we ever going to get out of the fossil fuel regime? Now, we're stepping out of it. It may feel like we're not stepping out of it fast enough for you, but something like half of the coal-fired power plants in the U.S. have been shut down or are in the process of being shut down or converted to natural gas. We stopped, it's just remarkable. The United States doesn't consume any more petroleum now than it did 15 years ago. the trend stopped going up. You remember when GM produced an electric car, an experimental electric car for 2 years? They let about 200 people have them experimentally in California, and they asked them to keep a little diary of their experiences. Do you like this car? Thinking about how are we going to market this? Everybody loved it, and then after 2 years, GM said, now give it back. And everybody said, no, we want to keep our car. We love it. And GM insisted that they all take it back, and they crushed them, and they took the car off the market. There's a documentary called Who Killed the Electric Car? If you're interested in this, it's a really good documentary. You remember this, you're nodding your head. So we didn't have electric cars for 2 decades after that, or a decade and a half. Suddenly, it's like the hottest selling vehicle on the market. Well, things change, and technology sometimes gives us an opportunity for change. Also, regional, national, and international conflict is another source of change that can lead to transitions. Well, what future do we have? For those of you who think the system is so entrenched and structural that it will never change, have hope. Bottom right, Trojan Nuclear Power Plant in Oregon. Shut down 20 years before the end of its projected lifespan because the people of Oregon said, we don't want it anymore. Closed it down and demolished it. The United States hasn't built a new nuclear power plant since 1983. I think they just authorized a new one in the South somewhere. I'm kind of bummed about that. So I won't be able to say that anymore. But up on the upper left, anybody know what that picture is? That's the Elwha Dam being dismantled. And that's just one example. There's all kinds of significant large dams being decommissioned, unlicensed, and slated for removal. We spent 100 years building dams, and nobody during that time period ever thought we'd be taking them down again so that the rivers could flow free, so that the fish would be in the river again. But that's exactly what we're doing. Values changed, economics changed, the questions our scientists asked changed. We made demands through democratic processes, and the Elwha was a 20-year battle. It was not easy. One of my graduate students at Washington State University wrote his master's thesis on that after it was decided that it should come down, and it took another 15 years before all the opposition in Congress to taking it down finally evaporated. And Congress came up with the money, and they removed it, and the river flows free, and the salmon are back. And the lower Elwha Sklallam tribe is happily helping to recover those salmon and recovering some of their cultural practices that they had lost. So things change, and this isn't the only one. Kennebec Dam in Maine came down even before that. Dams coming down in the Colorado Rockies. All right, kind of a big idea here, just a reminder to everybody, policies are driven by values. And one set of values that need to be sort of harmonized and balanced, but are often in conflict, are efficiency and equity. Most of that period from the 1960s to the 1990s was focused intensively on efficiency. The whole progressive era in the United States was all focused on efficiency, minimizing waste and maximizing productivity. It's a good value. I hate waste. I don't want to just denigrate it because it's a narrow economic sort of philosophy. It's an important one. But if all you do is base your policies on maximizing efficiency, there's all kinds of equity issues and social and cultural issues that are completely left out, that are marginalized or completely ignored. One of my mentors, Helen Ingram, the water policy scholar Helen Ingram, wrote a book called Water and Equity in the Southwest, and that kind of changed my thinking about water. And she talked about how water flows uphill toward money, that impoverished and minority communities generally don't get water from these big systems that we create. And the people, the urban areas and the majority members of a society and big corporations tend to get all the goodies. And if we don't think about the inequitable distribution of costs and benefits in our society, we cause all kinds of problems for ourselves. Not just moral problems about inequality, but all kinds of other problems. Poverty, unrest, And 100 years ago, it was about strikes. We don't have too many strikes anymore. But as a historian, when we had deep, deep levels of inequality in our society in the late 19th century, during the rise of industrialization, it led to a lot of social unrest and a lot of massive strikes. Private property versus the public interest. This is one of my favorite ones. I never get tired of talking about this. There's a whole segment of policymakers and economists out there who, sort of the libertarian capitalist, faith-based libertarian capitalists out there, who say the best way to allocate resources is to create private property rights and let the market decide how best to allocate those in a market. You know, to me, that's sort of like faith-based economics. It simplifies the world, abstracts it and simplifies it into this thing called efficiency and exchange, as if knowledge and exchange are equal. And, well, we all know what the flaws are in this. But we're never going to get rid of private property rights. We just need to balance it with concepts of the public interest. And the only way the public interest can be articulated is through democratic means like this. Nature as commodity versus nature as ecosystem, or as Gordon said earlier, nature as home. We're not going to stop thinking of nature as things that that have value to us, as Gordon said, things that we use, things that have value. That's going to stick with us. But at the same time, if we keep reminding ourselves and balancing that perspective with this recognition that nature is also a dynamic set of biological relationships of which we are a part, to which we owe obligations, that's such an important point. And I think we need to constantly be trying to balance those two out. Here's a good one we don't often talk about, but I think everybody probably thinks about it: democracy versus expertise and decision making. There's a lot of times in which I'm rooting for the experts against the majority of people who want the government to do something or the government to let them continue doing something. And I'm rooting for the scientists and the experts who are saying, no, we can't let you do that because we can't tolerate the consequences. On the other hand, there's a ton of times when I'm rooting for the people saying, the experts have it wrong, they're doing the wrong thing, they're taking us down the wrong path, we need to rise up, and we need a majority of people saying, this is the path that we should be on. I love both of them. It's a little schizophrenic. But we can't get rid of either one, and we have to figure out somehow how to balance those two together. Local versus regional versus national versus international. Every scale has a different set of stakes and values and interests and cultures. And water, we learned this morning, is fundamentally local, but it's also fundamentally global. What is that word that people are throwing around now? Glocal? Water is glocal. I hate that word. But I gave it to you, and you're stuck with it now. But so is policy. So is governance. Governance is sort of federalized. It's distributed. It's local, and it's state, provincial, and it's regional, and it's national, and it's global, World Bank and UN. And each one of those scales offers an opportunity for us to do something, but sometimes what we want at the local level is not consistent with what is wanted at the national level or the global level or the regional level. And we've got to keep the complexity in mind and come up with policies and governing systems that acknowledge the legitimacy of each one of those levels. The value of water. Gordon got me thinking about this again. Well, it has a market value. That's a common one that we hear most about. Resource economists are particularly interested in because that's something you can measure fairly easily. How much are you willing to pay for an acre-foot of water? But it also has production value, going all the way back to the early 19th century with the building of the first cotton textile mills on New England's rivers in the early 1800s. Some of the mill owners decided we need they had riparian rights. Water rights doctrine in the East back then was riparian rights. That is, you had the right to use water as it flowed across your property, but you couldn't impair it for the next person who owned that water as it flowed through their property downstream from you. We came up with a doctrine of prior appropriation rights in the arid West, which is totally different. You can own water, and you can take it out of the river, and you don't have to put it back. And if you got there first and put that water to use first, everybody else who came after you, unless you're a Native American, you don't count, everybody else who came after you has secondary rights to that. So we have two different water rights regimes, and I think Canada kind of paralleled that. You guys came up with a similar doctrine of prior appropriation in Western Canada based on, and ours came out of mining law, by the way. So anyway, mill owners in the early 20th century decided we need a way to commodify water into parcels that we can buy and sell as power parcels, because this wasn't hydroelectric power, this was mechanical power with water wheels. I got to go. All right, I'm almost done. And they came up with this term called 1 mill power. It was the amount of water needed to run a mill. And they started buying and selling mill powers. That's what I mean by production value. And that's what we've done with our hydropower system. Managers of the Columbia River hydropower system think of acre feet of water in production value terms. But then also, really importantly, we apply recreational values to water. Our lakes up here, rivers, fishing opportunity. Ecological value, which we ignored for most of the 20th century and since the 1970s have been paying a lot of attention to. It's there at the table. The people who are talking about the ecological value of water are at the decision-making table now in a way that they were not 2 generations ago. And of course, cultural and spiritual value, last but not least. My last slide, a few comments on emerging trends. We've already heard quite a bit about climate change, and we'll continue hearing more about it. Its effects on rivers, snowpack, water flow, timing are all going to be huge. And that's a crisis that leads to opportunity. Ecosystem function and ecological restoration are becoming more and more visible and influential at the decision-making table. If you're looking historically over the last 30 years, the trend has been towards more attention to ecosystem function and to ecological restoration. A lot of the dams that are coming down specifically designed to restore river ecosystems that have been destroyed by those reservoirs. A lot of work on restoration. In fact, one of the largest, fastest growing professional associations in North America is the Ecological Society or the Ecological Restoration. What's the name of that association? The Society for Ecological Restoration. It's fairly new. It's only been around, 25 years? And it's huge and growing and vibrant and dynamic. Would you agree? All right. So that's a trend. Trend towards paying more attention to and acknowledging and protecting in the courts Aboriginal rights and sovereignty issues. The Klamath tribe's great big success in many ways in Oregon, and you guys have even more successes up here in Canada. Renewable energy, smart grids, the rise of cheap batteries, providing stationary storage to meet peaks and valleys to sort of level out the problem of intermittency in renewable sources of energy like solar and wind. Just in the last 5 years, the technology for this has changed so dramatically that the entire realm of possibilities for energy has been completely transformed in just 5 years. For those who aren't paying attention to what's happening in a renewable energy field, it's revolutionary. The future is not going to look anything like the past, and it's mostly because of technological innovation. And finally, the water, energy, food nexus. Now, the Columbia River Treaty has always looked at the water energy nexus, but it has not been looking at the water, energy, food nexus, and this is sort of like a buzzword now globally, that these 3 systems are so intertwined they cannot be taken apart. Everything you do to any one of those has an impact on the others, and that we should be doing policy work and governance work focused on the relationships between water, energy, and food. Really quickly, in the Southwest, we can't produce any energy beyond about 15% of our needs. Actually, we can't produce any energy without water. Water provides our hydropower, and water provides the cooling and the steam for all of our thermal powered plants. So without water, we have no energy, and we're in a region with hardly any water. At the same time, without energy, we don't have any water. Only a third of the water that comes to Phoenix is gravity fed from rivers. 2/3 of it is pumped from the Colorado River, 1,000 feet uphill and 300 miles across the desert. And the other third comes from pumping from underground. Without electricity, we'd have 1/3 of the water that we have today. So there's no water without electricity, no electricity without water, and there's no food without water and electricity. And the sooner we start talking about them in an integrated way together, I think the better we'll be in managing the complex challenges that we face as a society. Oh, this is the last one. We need to design our institutions and our infrastructure for agility and adaptive capacity because we are in a time of rapid, unprecedented, large-scale change. And figuring out how to fix a problem today will not necessarily fix it tomorrow. And that the best thing we can do is to be agile and adaptive. Make our institutions, our policies, and our infrastructure as adaptive as possible because it's going to keep changing in some ways that we anticipate and many ways that we do not anticipate. Okay, that's the end. Thank you.
Who has a question for Paul or a comment for Paul?
I recognize you.
I'm going to take another kick at the can on this. And so where I want to go with this is we had Gordon talking about, the Aboriginal side, this, water as a spirit or that component.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a little bit of research, and there was a guy I heard on the CBC. His name is Sayed Hossein Nasser. He's got a PhD from Harvard. He teaches at George Washington University. And he did a paper or a book in 1968. And he's Islamic, traditional Islamic environmentalism. And it's called The Encounter of Man and Nature, the Spiritual Crises of Modern Man. He published that in 1968. So where I'm going with this is you go back to 1650 and the 1700s, the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, Sir Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and so you had this divergence on the European model where you looked at strictly science by itself without this other component. Yet in the world you have your native people still maintain that. You have the Islamic component. Oh, sorry. I was getting caught up there. You have the Islamic component still recognize that. And you made a statement here, big corporations get all the goodies. We had Dr. Schindler earlier this morning talk about economics as a religion. So where do you see this evolving?
Okay, I'll make this quick.
Yeah, sorry.
Actually, should I use this? There's a really interesting theory that the rise of the Enlightenment and rationalism desacralized nature. Bacon gave us permission to treat nature as stuff rather than as living beings with spirit. And there's been a long tradition of critique of Western culture as having, this rationalist turn, as having given us sort of permission to not feel bad about clear-cutting a mountainside and damming a river and the mass production way that we do our fisheries, et cetera. I think it's true that we need to balance both a rational view of ourselves in the world with a spiritual view of ourselves as living beings in a living ecosystem with obligations to that ecosystem. That's the great challenge that we face today. To what extent do we treat nature as sacred? Because we think, even us rational people think that some things are sacred, like the human being, but somehow at some point, our culture sort of decided that there's a wall somewhere after the human beings end, and everything else is not quite sacred. And I think it's a worthwhile and interesting conversation to have, is whether that wall truly exists or whether that's a story we told ourselves to make ourselves feel better about what we were doing to sacred nature.
You mentioned equity, but you didn't touch on the topics of conservation and lifestyle. I don't think we can get everybody up to our resource and water gobbling levels without undoing all of the other things that we're here to talk about. So what about conservation and lifestyle?
Yeah, voluntary simplicity as a philosophy goes back, hundreds of years or longer, and I think we should try to recover some of that. I can remember in the 1960s and 70s, I was one of them. I was a flower child, tree-hugging hippie in the early 70s, and I didn't want a car, didn't want a house, and didn't want to own much, and wanted to live life to the fullest. And I've become a middle-class consumer in many ways, but I haven't sort of lost my sense that there's a certain point at which enough is enough. And I think one of the problems with modern consumer culture is that too few people have any sense of when enough is enough. And accumulation just for the sake of accumulation seems to be, a sort of an ethic that's acceptable. And we need to be talking more about limits. But how do you define limits? I mean, it's a slippery slope, because, then you get the equity argument about, well, here you are, first world people, with your comforts and your conveniences, and now you're saying we can't come up to the same level as you. That is an equity argument. And I think it's an intractable conundrum to figure out how to respond to that. I don't think we can do it structurally. I think we have to do it with a sort of a moral and cultural change. And it's going to take a long time, and it'll probably require some crises. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I do know that I've read probably for the last 20 years that the biggest global change is coming from the revolution of rising expectations. And those expectations are driven by visual and social media knowledge more than ever. Right. It's not that they're totally accurate, but that's what the rest of the world thinks, not only just equity inside Canada or equity inside the US, and we can see some of it in the Middle East and the migrations. That's tied to this too, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know where it will come from, because we don't have the morality coming from religious institutions anymore. I don't know if we have even an agreement that there will ever be voluntary simplicity. So,
right.
Scarcity?
Yeah.
Maybe scarcity.
A little sliver of hope. The students that I see in my classes now seem a lot more aware of and troubled by inequality in the world and by consumerism. A lot of students don't really care to have a car, and they want to live in a walkable city. There's a cultural change taking place now in the current generation of students that I haven't seen in a really long time, and it gives me a little bit of hope that maybe there'll be some cultural change. We should be focusing on uplifting the people who don't have clean water, don't have electricity, are living in poverty, and stop focusing on how can we get more and more ourselves. But that's going to be a tough row to hoe, especially a sort of a non-cosmopolitan and parochial culture like the United States.
One more, right here.
Yesterday in Washington at the Atlantic Forum, James Follow asked this question of Al Gore. His question was, if you had to pick one thing that you could recommend for change, what would that be? And the answer was, he advocated for a form of redemocratization, to get power away from the 10%, I suppose that's being generous, I think it was 1%, yeah. And give that back to the people whose lives are mostly impacted by all of the changes that were needed. I'd like to hear your comment on that.
I agree with it. I think the greatest moral challenge in America today is the concentration of power and wealth in the 1/10 of the 1%. Citizens United decision opened the floodgates to serious dysfunction in our democracy. And I see in today's current debate and the upcoming presidential debate more recognition that this problem has to be fixed than I've seen in quite a long time. Because we've had a long run of powerful, wealthy people controlling our democratic processes and our elections. But it's worse now than it's ever been in my lifetime, and there's a recognition of that. I don't know if it'll be successful in 2016 or if it's going to take a little bit longer, but looking as a historian over the long term, whenever something builds up to that kind of a level of unacceptability and near crisis, something usually gets done. Doesn't totally fix it, but it ameliorates the problem enough that we can move on, and I think that will happen.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Paul Hirt for his presentation. Thanks, Paul.